So let's move on to the fourth panel. We have got to, we've got to finish a certain time at the Science Museum. So the fourth panel is on data-driven medicine and the NHS as strategic partner. We were going to have representatives from NHS England, Vindawaka and Ming Tang, but unfortunately because of their pre-election period and rules, they had to drop out. So in their place, we've still got a star-studded panel. So very grateful that Professor Andrew Morris has agreed to chair the panel, and Will Browne joined us at the last minute as part of the panel. So thank you very much. So I'll hand over to Andrew Morris. Thank you, Andrew.
Good afternoon, and I'm sure people will filter in. So it's a great pleasure to chair this panel. My name's Andrew Morris. I'm a doctor. I'm director of the National Institute of Health Data Science, called HDR UK. I'm also president of the Academy of Medical Sciences. And as we all know, we thought the only important event last week in the UK was going to be the FA Cup final. But sadly, the Prime Minister decided to call an election. So, and as such, as Munir says, Vin and Ming, who are two fantastic colleagues, are constrained by the pre-election period. What we're going to have is a very high energy and optimistic session about how the NHS can be a key strategic partner in life sciences, specifically around data-driven innovation. Because if we think of some of the themes of today, we had a fantastic talk from Miles. The feedstock of artificial intelligence is data. Secondly, we heard about precision public health from Tamsin in the last session. The feedstock of population health is data. And finally, we're going to touch upon how do we make clinical trials better in terms of speed, quality, and cost. The feedstock of clinical trials is data. So the question for this very distinguished panel is how can the UK be in the top decile internationally by working in partnership with the NHS to unleash the power of data whilst earning the trust of the publics. So that's the exam question. Can we routinely run studies on 68 million people? Because that should be our ambition. And as I think you've all read the biographies of this very distinguished panel. So what I'm going to suggest is that we go along from Michelle to Will to Richard to Adrian, and they'll pull out a theme each. And the first theme we're going to focus on is clinical trials. So Michelle, how do we get to the top 10th decile in clinical trials?
So, clinical development is an area that I've been focused on for a while. My background, I'm a physician scientist, and I did clinical research at Stanford for a number of years before starting a company that really sought to address the kind of barrier we face in clinical development around data. So how do we connect with patients? How do we really generate high quality data, ultimately to develop drugs faster? And I think if we just take a step back and think, okay, have we really leveraged technology? Have we really leveraged data? I think the evidence would suggest no, simply looking at the output of the system. The number of drugs approved per year really hasn't changed in the last 15 years. And I believe that if we applied technology and really saw the leverage of technology, we would be moving the needle on the output because the time and cost curve would be bent. So, I think as an American and residing in the United States, but operating a company globally with many clinical trials here in Britain, I think, what the NHS offers is extremely unique. And one of the key challenges we face in the United States is that the academic medical centers, where a lot of the leading physicians who want to be a part of drug development reside, it's not amenable to clinical development, in large part because of the data fluidity and some of the barriers to entry. Versus the NHS, I think you guys have done a great job of reducing some of the barriers around really making that data accessible. And where I think, if your question is how do you get to this, upper decile of performance in clinical development, I would say it really comes down to three key areas of utilization of data. One, patient identification and patient enrollment. Clearly, we know the 12-year timeline to getting a drug approved through the in-human testing is a huge bottleneck, is the patient identification. The second is around, actually activating the trial. You could think of the NHS infrastructure as almost a research superhighway, where you should be able to actually activate a trial very quickly because of the connectivity you have between the doctors and the patients through the infrastructure that will hit upon. And I would say then the third area really is around how you answer the key questions. One of the key areas that our company focuses on is the drug effective? And one of the major drivers of the timelines in clinical development is the fact that the sensitivity and specificity of how we measure drug efficacy is really limited and fairly low, I think, compared to what digital and more sensitive data could actually provide. So imagine that we could actually measure a disease that's going after an Alzheimer's disease indication with more sensitivity and more specificity. That really comes down to the quality of the data. I think the NHS is in a perfect position to actually introduce novel endpoints, some of which were discussed this morning, that improve our disease measurement, therefore reduce the number of patients required in a clinical trial, and ultimately then speed up the timelines. So, from patient enrollment to activation of the studies to actually the measurement of the intervention, I think you're really well positioned to bend the time cost curve. With that said, I think there's still some work to do, but that would be my recommendation.
So, Michelle, can I thank you for being optimistic, too? Because I always think we should consider the NHS as an asset rather than a liability. It is now a research superhighway.
Yes, officially today.
It's officially today. So thank you. So if we're going to have a research superhighway, we need infrastructure, data, and services which are scalable, reliable, sustainable, interoperable, and secure for 68 million people. Infrastructure as a service. How are we doing in that provision of infrastructure as a service across the 4 nations of the UK?
Yeah, I think we've come a long way. The last 5 years has been a really interesting journey as we've understood. But we really could do this. The infrastructure is there. And we've moved from, I think, some of the footpaths of data transfer, where you just move big gigabytes of data from one location, copy it to another location where researchers do their work, to the trams, the superhighway, the train stations, which people can get off and on for. And at the moment, I think about the 3 big initiatives in terms of infrastructure and relate those to the purposes of the data. So direct care, we have the NHS app and all the infrastructure around that, providing a way for patient to view their data and only their data, and no data is stored in the app at the moment. And so that's a direct feed in, what do I know about me? Then there's the operational and planning of a health infrastructure. That's the federated data platform. And that's shown, the previous to that we had the COVID data store, which showed some amazing capabilities. We worked with Ming Tang, who is in here, on the vaccine equalities tool. So what we managed to do is, because this superhighway existed for vaccinations, we could show a local system in your area on a map by deprivation profile, by age band, by ethnicity, where are the gaps, where do they live, and what are you going to do about it? And that happened day in, day out. And that was an information superhighway. Now, the federated data platform should be able to do the same, but for operational planning. How do we make a hospital work well? How do we make a population receive care well? And then the final initiative we've got is the secure data environments and a network of those that we have a large investment for. I think these are fascinating, maybe the thing to focus on today, because they're being designed with specific use cases in mind and infrastructure and capabilities that are going to be replicable across England. We've also got Research Data Scotland and we've got Wales as well, but the focus is on England here. And those use cases, I think, are going to really chime. We've got real-world evidence, straightforward. We've got epidemiology, we've got health system planning, we've got our clinical trials, we've got translational research, and then we've got AI and algorithm development. And that's a really ambitious set of things to try and cover with one initiative. And so the functional capabilities required for that, the governance required for that, and the data for that are being worked on actively. And I think what we've kind of started really well, we have national data sets that work for commissioning, so the administrative data, HES, everyone Probably it's not brilliant, but it's pretty good for what we've got. And then we've got linking that to primary care. And now we have, in parts of England, places where you can do research which link those together with social care, primary care, diagnostic data, and start to provide, oh wow, we can actually talk about this healthcare population in the real world. We just did some work with the London STE on dementia. What is the economic burden of dementia? And we could do things we've never been done before. 27,000 people with dementia in London. What is the cost of those people? What are they doing? And where does it fall? Turns out 50% of it falls on social care and families. We didn't know that. We didn't know that 1.6% fell on treatment and diagnosis. That seems small. So it starts to answer these questions really quickly. Obviously, there's a kind of a way to go. And some of that functional capability needs to be nationalized. There needs to be a harmonization of the data. There needs to be standardization of the data. But with that combination of local sharing, which I think patients are happy with, and then national capability and functional capability, which can be pushed down, there's a nice system where we have a node at the top which pushes things down and navigates to where it's best to do that data, and then hopefully make that superhighway super fast.
Okay, so we're going to be speeding on the superhighway, Richard.
There will be speed limits, I hope.
Right, okay. And so thank you, Will. And you touched upon it, and it's fantastic we've got Richard here today, because access to data in healthcare can be quite an emotive issue. And demonstrating trustworthiness and being honest, reliable, and competent to earn that social contract is so important. So, Richard, any advice about how, as we assemble the infrastructure, data, and services, how do we work with the publics?
Oh, hell, what an interesting question. I feel like I'm sitting here in clinic. Right, so working with the public is different to working with the patients. And patients will have different perspectives about their data according to the problem they are facing. So someone who is newly diagnosed with their first problem when they're 30 will have a different perspective to someone who is on, just to take a random example, has just turned 65, is already taking 12 pills a day, and has just had a new damn diagnosis. It's arthritis in both knees, in case you're wondering. So the problem we have had in the past is that NHS's communications have not been as positive as they might be, and above all, they haven't been as clear as they might be. So we've had people understandably talking about data as a commercial asset, and everything we have heard today about what do the patients get out of it has been subsumed behind that opening statement. What we now have is consultations going on regionally around the country, saying things like, what are your health priorities for your regions? And we're starting there and then beginning to address the issue of sharing data that way. In other words, the inference from the start is, what will we get out of it? And some of the stuff is blindingly obvious, I'm afraid. We would like a health service where it doesn't take 5 weeks to see a GP face-to-face. Especially not if you're trying to present with a lesion that might be skin cancer. They do actually have to see it. Calm. Think of the blood pressure pills. So that's one thing. But also, we don't talk about NHS data and what it can do. We mention it loads of times, but we don't say this is NHS data. So last couple of days, doctors going on strike again, 1.4 million appointments being cancelled. Bad news, but nevertheless, NHS data. And if I want to go back just to the clinical trials thing, one of the things we know from clinical trials, looking at data and published peer-reviewed research papers, is that if you go to a hospital offering lots and lots of clinical trials, your outcomes are likely to be better. You don't have to be on the trials. Just go to a hospital, a trial centre that's offering lots and lots of trials. Your outcomes will be better. If you are on a clinical trial, your experience of care is better. And this is good news stories about data that we are not sharing widely enough. So I want to be on the optimistic side, which is, we've got good stories, especially the life sciences industry. You've got good stories. Let us share them far more than we are doing.
Okay, thank you, Richard, for that. I think that 10 out of 10 for optimism, so we're like that. But we're going to maintain that spirit. We're going to go to Adrian now. So the other day we had a very senior colleague from NICE present to us, and he says that in terms of submissions to NICE, I think it was 93% of submissions have some kind of real-world evidence to support the case. So what are the opportunities from this data infrastructure for real-world evidence?
Just contemplating the secure data environments that were mentioned earlier, the NHS does present a unique opportunity you can't find anywhere else in the world. Imagine more than 90% of people or healthcare occurs within this environment, right? And that means the data capture of every single interaction that happens is captured in that whole data set. Imagine using that data set to fully map out a patient journey from start to finish, from womb to tomb, as some people say, right? And understanding which pathways diverge from the norm, which pathways will have better outcomes than others. I think that is the potential that real-world evidence presents. But looking at the superhighway analogy that was spoken about earlier, we know highways in England, right? Lots of construction happening all the time. Some roads lead to nowhere. There's a pothole suddenly somewhere. And I think that is also the story of data in our country, right? Well-intentioned projects, such as the secure data environment, have been conceived maybe a few years back, but it's only now that we're having public consultations on NHS data, right? And Richard can attest to that. And so for me, the potential there still remains. England or the whole of the UK presents this integrated data set that is unmatched, unparalleled. But other countries are catching up. They know what we're doing here. So countries like the United States have federated systems of hospital systems where you have that whole data set, but they don't capture 90% of the population. So there's still holes there. So for me, the potential of real-world evidence and data, especially for understanding patient-important outcomes, for providing insight to health systems, how to make their services more efficient, and finally for physicians to really choose the best medication there is, I think is the optimistic side of it. But how do we get there? I think that's the more important question today.
Okay, so you've posed the question, how do we get there? So how do we get there?
I love the Socratic method. I also teach at Imperial, but yeah, I sometimes do that. Yeah, I think in terms of really looking at moving the NHS forward, it's seen as this humongous beast with so many different parts, so many different components. And one way that as a member of the life sciences community that we are doing, helping move that forward is through investment. The life sciences organizations in the UK and even globally have always turned to UK data, not just for NICE submissions, but even FDA submissions, submissions to the EMA. Even countries in the Asia Pacific use UK data. So I think the investment is there. There is, as Will was talking about earlier, a relative reluctance of some organizations to share that data, and we understand why. But going back to what Richard mentioned, it is about showing the value, returning that value back to the patients themselves. And this is where I think Hilary Fanning, who is current head of the Data for R&D program, has, if I can quote her, she put it beautifully. She said, the NHS does not produce medications, does not develop diagnostic tests. It's the life sciences industry that does that. And if NHS and the wider public can understand the benefits that their use of data will incur, and if those benefits return back to patients in the form of better medications, faster treatment times, even reduced mortality, reduced morbidity all across, I think we'll have a more accepting view of the use of data in healthcare.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask a question to all of you now around partnership with industry and how we interface with industry. And a story. So a mate of mine is John Halamka, who is the CIO. He was in Boston. He's now CIO of the Mayo Clinic. And over the last 3 to 4 years, They have a learning health system. So they've abstracted 14 million Mayo lives, I think they're called, in Wisconsin, Florida, and Arizona, and put them on the Google Cloud, and they've de-identified. And then they've got innovation sitting on near real-time data. And that has required a very close relationship with industry. And actually, if you look at the infrastructure that arguably is required, it's not going to be pharma that delivers this. It's going to be Google, Amazon. So how do we engage with those companies in a trustworthy way to deliver these scalable services? So maybe start with you, Will.
I think it's a great question, and I think the other people involved with that are the providers of the EHR systems.
Yeah.
Should be involved in the conversation. The infrastructure, as you said, the NHS doesn't make diagnostics, doesn't make MRIs, it shouldn't make compute, it shouldn't be looking after wires and metals in their machines, on their services and in their places. The contracts with those, I think, are they're very transactional. What's more important is the architecture, the design of that, and the governance that sits around that, so that we understand when we do a transformation from a trust EHR or a primary care EHR to the standardization the NHS wants, which at the moment is OMOP CDM, that is a clear process of where the data moves from here to a place where it is pseudonymized and accessible for research, but it doesn't go any further than that. What we want to stop doing, which is, and I think this is not something that necessarily those large providers of services would like, is the duplication of that same data set 50 times around the country, which means it's being hosted 50 different times on 50 different clouds and being reused in different places. That's not sensible. What we want to be saying is the data sits in one place, in one location, we move analysis to that data, and we go from there. And so that requires us to understand what's possible with the data, but not try and do the same thing in local environments everywhere. So that is working out what the infrastructure and the architecture is that best enables us to leave the data where it is or close to where it is and do the processing and the technical architecture around that. Okay,
so interpreting that, the Amazon marketplace across the UK doesn't have 50 marketplaces. It's platform as a service. Okay. Anyone else want to touch upon?
I think what has to be understood as well is the governance process behind access to data. I'll give you an example. So within my organization, before you even request data externally, you have to pass through 7 different steps, including ethical review, technical review, scientific review, strategic review, business review, financial review, etc. And that's internal, before you even make a request. Once you make the request to, let's say, the London STE, that undergoes a data access committee review, which includes members of the public. So what people need to understand is that through all these different steps, it's not like we want to do this data access whenever we want, because it involves all these steps, a lot of resources just going into that. And so when you go back to the reason why we use that data in the first place, what makes it worth it to go through that process, it is really showing that benefit, not just for us. And I think the London SD is a very good example of providing, in their form, a specific benefit. You have to state explicitly how Londoners will benefit from that specific project. And I think gating data access that way, and also understanding that there's this onerous process we're already undergoing just to get there, makes us understand, okay, should I have 11 different, because the NHS England wants to create 11 different SDs all across the country. Do I want to do that 7-step process 11 different times over? Or I now understand that if I do that in London, then probably people in Birmingham will benefit from that study. Maybe people in Manchester will benefit from that study. So the regulation is there, governance is there, but we also have to configure how the NHS understands how that governance works, or we'll turn everyone else off from the process.
Yeah, just to add one thing that I think is interesting coming from the technology provider side is, I do think the internal expertise on the architecture really matters, because Will and is highlighting this kind of notion that, say it's Epic, you have all of these different instances, and this is probably a byproduct of this being a US company where hospital systems do not want patients to go from the Mayo to, say, MD Anderson, for example. But those are solvable problems, because I can also tell you that our infrastructure sits on top of Google, and we're a Google partner. And if you want to activate a research superhighway and you're a Google user, you can do that. But it does require the internal kind of technical expert who can understand how to pull these different technologies together in a way that leads that to that value that you're talking about, and where you can actually demonstrate that ideally faster, cover those hurdles, cross those hurdles with fewer barriers.
Okay. Now I've got a...
Sorry, can I just...
Of course.
There's something just triggered here, because I think the governance issue, Genomics England have got a really interesting model, because from the word go, they had participants, the people donating their genomes sat on their data access review committee. But there's two other things that actually sit alongside that. It's not just the people sitting on the committee. Every application to have access to that data has to have a plain language stroke lay summary of their application, which Genomics England publishes. It's on the website, so anyone can see what their data is being used for and who wants to use it. And they also, the Access Review Committee also reviews the access. You know, a year, 2 years, 3 years ago, we granted you access. What have you done with it? Where's the benefit? I go to my local trust, which I love dearly, my local hospital trust. They've got all my data. They've helped keep me alive for 26 years since the first diagnosis. I have no idea what they're doing with my data or who they're giving it to. So there is still this strange split in our country about what we're doing. But of course, Genomics England, most of that access is from the life sciences industry. And to me, there is no doubt that that is the way forward. We just need to be a bit more dynamic about the whole thing and get patients on board physically, sitting on the governance committees, saying this is what the data's going for. Put it on the website.
Just to add the final point onto that, which is the next step, which I think everyone should be following, is the code that is used to run that analysis also has to be open.
Yeah.
So not just the lay summary, but the code used, and that has to be shared. There's no secrets there.
I completely agree, but that's way beyond my understanding.
So you're talking about transparency, and actually one of the last reports to come out of, I can say this now, the last government, was from the Public Affairs Committee just last week, which talked about evidence-based policy making, and one key recommendation was transparency. Who's using data, for what purposes, and what is the public benefit? So I think getting on the front foot about being transparent about how data are used by whom is very important. So it's a great point, Richard. So I'm going to have one final question, then we're going to open it up to the audience. So my final question is, because in the UK, health policy has devolved to the 4 nations, so it's sort of sovereign. But science is global. So how do we ensure in the UK that we maintain an international relevance in our use of data? That's a tricky one, isn't it? Who wants to take that?
I'll have a first crack. I think this is something that Scotland have been ahead of the game on, which is taking on a common data model that is used everywhere. So for research, OMOP is what Research Data Scotland have been using, Edinburgh and the Data Lock have been pushing that forward, and NHS England are playing catch up. But what we can do now is we can start setting some of those standards. And so that common data model means, and there are cancer examples across Leeds and Edinburgh and internationally, I want to run the same analysis across these centres. Go. And it federates the analysis. We understand the same data means the same thing in everywhere. And so you can say, actually, we can do a multi-centre international trial very easily, and we should do it in the UK because they're the best at it.
With my HDR hat on, we are supporting folk to put their data into OMOP as a start. You lose resolution, and it's not perfect. The other thing which we should consider, I think, because we talk about AI use of the data, but it's use of AI tools for curation. And I think that will be an excellent, because at the moment it's a very manual process. So that's an area. Okay, we're going to open it up. So who wants to ask questions about this superhighway? Maybe say who you are, so I know it's Trevor.
Trevor Jones. I spent the last 7 years on the Bevan Commission advising the Wales Minister of Health and First Minister on how to modify the system. 7 independent health authorities all chasing a budget. But one thing they didn't have was a commonality of databases. Now I understand in England it's 22 different health authorities. Wouldn't it be good if the new administration of whatever colour, or the head of the NHS, was to suddenly overnight say, stop, you're going to use one single system for electronic health records? Wouldn't that be a way forward?
Okay, so this is an impartial panel because we're in the pre-election zone. But that's a very clear statement. Any other questions from Richard?
Thank you. Richard Talbot from the ABPI. And it sort of builds on Trevor's question to some degree, but it's specifically about the secure data environments, and yes. Great panel discussion, by the way, and really buy into the optimism. There's one bit of pessimism that I keep hearing, though, and I'd love the panel to either validate it or unpick it or tell me that it's wrong. Whether they're academic researchers or medical research charities or global industry R&D folk, the consistent message I keep getting on the regional SDEs is that we don't get how we're going to access it. There's not a clear roadmap to giving us a single analytic framework. We kind of buy into the fact that you've got to organise. There are good reasons for organising and curating at a regional level, but how do we make it simple, particularly for global researchers, to tap into it and do the sort of studies they need to do?
Okay, so great question from Richard. So how do we have a single shop window which is understandable and easy to use? Who wants to take that one?
I sit in the data I think committee within ABPI, so I'm also biased in that sense. My view of how we can operationalize that is to have a single gated access point for the national secure data environment. I know that it is a work in progress. I know that even at a regional level, SDEs are scrambling to get their act together and make sure they're run well. There are a few SDEs that are exemplars in this respect, where there already is a clear way to access their data. There's good governance, patients sit on that committee, and there is clear need for benefit to the locality. But that model hasn't been disseminated to the rest of the SDEs. So for me, the ideal would be, as Richard is talking about, a single gated secure data environment. But I fear that maybe years down the road. So hopefully we can accelerate that with the next government.
Okay, Will, do you want to come in?
Yeah, we're actually doing a project at the moment with NHS ESTs on navigating this process. So I think stage one is, what does the data that everyone's got? How does it link? What's the latency? And what functional capabilities do you have? That map then leads to initially just a concierge service of, okay, what do you want? And that front door is, what do you want to do in what therapeutic area? Great, okay, well, we'd say go talk to these 3 people. And that's a little bit manual, but it's better than we have now. What that needs to link into, which I'm hoping you're going to jump in as well, the HDR UK Information Gateway, which is a catalogue of all data assets that exist in the UK. The metadata behind it could then be automated, and we have a wonderful system of concierge for those who want to be manual, and then slightly more automated approach through HDR UK when you need to. So I think those 2 are the kind of next 12-month solution to it.
Okay, do you want to come back, Richard? Are you convinced? Maybe get the mic. Do you have a mic? Right.
So thank you very much. Well, we are where we are, and I really appreciate the answers. I suppose what my colleagues would say to me is front doors work if they let you in. If it's a front door to a block of flats, it's a bit more complicated. So a catalogue and a concierge to another layer of a multiplicity of different frameworks doesn't actually allow us, as Adrian put it, to have a means of doing some analysis. And I think particularly plugging the UK to the point about international competitiveness as well into global studies, particularly for rare diseases, that starts to become really important. Yes. So thanks for what you're doing, but anything we can do to accelerate the journey. Yeah. And so final comment is, if we're doing projects like this, really important to talk to the end users, again, whether they're industrial or academic or whatever.
So some key messages there around user-centered design. Who was it who said, meet your customer at their door? So I think that the metaphor I sometimes use is power stations on a grid. And when you plug into the electricity, we have a 3-pin plug wherever you are. So, okay, so that's fantastic.
Mel Walker. So I was just curious, if we achieve this sort of aspirational vision of connecting up all of the data sets in the UK, having a single front door and being able to access it easily, I was curious to know what the panel thinks. How internationally competitive will that sort of new aggregated data set be? Because it seems to be, there's some real rich sources, genomics data, we've talked a bit about that. So it seems like it could have some real advantages from a scale and a type of data perspective over other sort of major markets like the US. We know there's a lot of commercially available data sets in the US. Would anyone care to comment on that? Thank you.
So what a great question, because we talked about the top decile. Who else is in that decile? And I can tell you everyone's chasing this. It's not this is a novel idea, so it's about delivery. So who else is in that decile?
Some of the Nordic countries, I think. So the Swedish national data set. So the Nordics, I'd say in the US, health systems, individual health systems, but nothing at a national level. China is getting close to it, but it's a closed door for now. They're a bit non-transparent about what they're doing, but we're hearing that they're integrating things at a national level. So if they do it first, and that's more than 1 billion people, then what is 65 million people, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Are you content? Where would you want to go for your information superhighway?
I don't know. I mean, I obviously I'm a sort of passionate about this topic too, but I think we have a chance of being right up there in the top 2 or 3 if we crack this nut. And I think that's really exciting for the UK for life sciences, because while we're lagging behind maybe in medicine's uptake or the margins that life sciences make on medicines, we could be strategically very important from a point of view of data, but also from a point of view of collaboration and the way we do things in the UK. I think the UK is a market where we can test out new models, and maybe those models could then be transplanted to other markets too.
Sorry, Michelle.
I was going to say, I think that the value of the currency is much higher in the future because of AI. So you could imagine, the foundational models that could be developed across a number of different areas. Should you be kind of the first to get there? I think then the big question, is like, what's the diversity from a human genomics perspective and human diversity perspective of that? But I think I think that the presentation at lunch was so compelling that Miles gave. All of those things are fueled by data, and nobody has that data at the scale that you guys potentially could right now, unless China beats you. But I still don't think they'll open it up for other people to use.
Yeah.
And maybe
sorry. Just to lower the optimism slightly, the suspicion I have, if I take off my patient advocate hat and just wear my patient one, we still have to remember we're talking about access to our data that we have given to our NHS. And actually very few patients in the UK have this vision of the UK being an international superhighway for healthcare data. Lovely idea, but like I said earlier, we'd actually like to have a better health service, new drugs available faster, kinder drugs. That would be lovely, especially for things like cancer, where you have to live with the consequences for donkey's years. That's the kind of stuff that interests us. What's the quid pro quo? You can have our data, but what do we or our health service get out of it?
Okay, so that benefit share articulation, I think, is one. To give a little hope, earlier this year in The Lancet, it was the first publication on 68 million people, which linked GP data with HES data, with vaccination data, with outcome data. Aziz Sheikh, Kathy Sudlow, a whole team did it. So we can do this with public engagement every step of the way. So I think but it's not quick enough. We need to speed on. Right, we've got lots more questions.
Sorry.
No, you've got to prod me.
Hi, I just want to caveat, I am an optimist.
Yeah.
However, my name's Dion Rogers. I'm Chief Nursing Informatics Officer at Barking, Havering and Redbridge NHS Trust in North East London. We are still on paper. A London trust. About a fifth of trusts, secondary care trusts, are still on paper in the UK. So I just wanted to bring in a bit of a reality check. Now, I've just finished a master's in AI and data analytics, and I'm all for this, but we are on paper. So my question, and it may not require an answer now, but it's something to leave you with, is what role and responsibilities does life sciences have to connect our data inputters, essentially my nurses, in the majority of the cases, to data?
Okay, so great question around digital maturity. Who wants to
I feel
take
that's
that?
directed to me because it's on the life sciences. I think there have been many initiatives spurred by life sciences companies that improve coding, whether or not that's infrastructure investment, training up people to learn to code, clinical coding, or even investing in FTE at a local level. Is there no coder in this trust or that trust? But to be honest, I think these investments are the responsibility of NHS. What we're doing is almost like patchwork kind of assistance. My hope is that, just in line with the other questions earlier, with the next government, we will hopefully see more investment in the NHS. We will not be using Windows 98 anymore, for example. Doctors will be more incentivized to work, and GPs, they code as well, right? And if they have more fulfilling work, they have more time to properly code things, and that will also enrich data sets. We can recruit more patients into clinical trials. So this chronic underfunding of the NHS, I think, is what we're seeing towards the tail end of this era. So hopefully we'll have a more optimistic future ahead of us.
Still a difficult sell, though. We need more doctors, yes. We need more nurses, yes. We need more data coders.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very good point. And actually, I was just thinking, because I think the investment's about 2 to 3% in this space, so which is about 4 billion a year, roughly. So OpenAI is valued at $86 billion. So there's a bit of a disparity there.
And maybe to come on to your point about paper, the one I love is April 2020, the government announced the NHS AI fund, which was kind of £100 million, and the same month they banned you from buying new fax machines. And so that was the scale difference. And then when we were working closely with a trust in Bristol, and I had a couple talking about exactly this, how we're going to get productivity, and he got out his phone and showed me, I've got 38 logins and passwords I have to remember to do any of this. That's got to be fixed first, and I think that, I don't know who pays for that single sign-on, but that's a completely different problem. But it's the kind of backbone of all of this.
Getting the basics right. Okay, please move us on from fax machines.
I'll take one step at least aside. So you've alluded to the Nordics and to organizations in America that are private as model systems to look to. I'd like to point another one where it's sort of bottom up, which is not geographic or anything, it's the rare disease community. Mm-hmm. So the rare disease community has been ahead of the curve in this for a long time, not because we're smarter, but because of necessity, really. And the level of data sharing, because of the natural fragmentation, which is just the nature of the beast in rare disease, has been really good. So I would basically urge you to look at how the rare disease community has been doing this, where a lot of this is led by patient organizations and in very close collaborations with actual clinicians, where data is being shared and data pools are being built at the level of patient groups, which encapsulate a lot of that. And I just think it's a very good model to look to. The other thing is how things were done during COVID. Again, necessity. speed was of necessity, again, suddenly a lot of barriers were broken. So those were two places I would definitely look to in implementing.
One of the interesting things you cite about the patient advocacy groups is you look at a company like Vertex and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, right? So the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation had this large, data asset essentially from all of the patients. And then they were able to license that on royalties to Vertex Pharma and fund back into the patient advocacy group. So the models, I think, get really interesting. But to your point, I think, the patient advocacy groups they're really a very powerful link, as is the incentive system to benefit all parties involved.
So I thought what you've described there is alignment of incentives. Mm-hmm. And I think part of this is how do we better align incentives? Because I think it was Charlie Munger, who, as you know, was Warren Buffett. He said, show me the incentives and I'll tell you the behavior. And the rare disease community have to collaborate because of the N. And in COVID, we had a common purpose which aligned incentives. So I think that is a good point. My fellow committee member.
Sorry, Bruce Campbell. Slightly following from the last question, a comment and a question. It was 2001 that the late Sir Michael Rawlins and I sat down with what was, I think, then NHS Digital and said, we'd like data. We'd like some data, please, on new procedures. And it was all too difficult. And so over about 15, 20 years, we did meetings with the FDA, we did leaders in the Lancet, all sorts of things. And so I'm delighted to hear today's panel, because suddenly, over the last 5 or 6 years, the world has caught up with it. But one thing that's been going on during all of that, which we very much espoused, is quite a lot of specialties, big specialties, in various countries, the National Joint Registry here and in Scandinavia and in the USA, the cardiac surgeons. They have all got very, very granular, very high-quality databases. And we discussed with the FDA a few years ago about how to get collaboration between these, and that was started to be achieved. And I just wondered, you're talking in a slightly different paradigm now with entire healthcare systems. How do you see those very mature specialty databases now working in this area?
What a good question. Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I know there are a couple companies working on this. So Versana, for example, was a company that worked with I think it was the AAO, American Academy of Ophthalmology, and actually was able to leverage some of that data for drug submissions. I think also recently Tempus bought a company that was the data from the American Cancer Society. So to your point, these are very, very, very rich, granular clinical data sets that actually can answer real-world questions in ways that other data sets can't.
And to build on that, I think within the UK, a lot of the work that HDR UK have done, the British Heart Foundation Data Science Centre, DataCan, these are specialty data sets that can then, this hasn't happened yet, but will be associated with the front door from STEs to allow, you've got this use case, this therapeutic area, this will be directed through that way. And the hosting then sort of is tangential to what you're trying to do, but you're linked in that way.
Okay, good question. We're going to go over here to this gentleman.
Yeah, hi, Simon Roslingham from Behold.ai. Cybersecurity and data. We have confirmation that 40 million electoral records have been hacked in the UK. We've had confirmation that the veterinary payroll system has been hacked down to the bank account level. And we're going to provide a single door access to the data. Should I or we be worried? And what is the remedy? Thank you.
What a good question. Security. Who wants to pick that one up?
Well, from an infrastructure perspective, I think the point is that you don't move the data. A single front door means that you can, Open Safety, I think, is the best example of this. Open Safety, you write the code, you submit the code openly, that PR gets pushed down. All of the processing runs on the servers of the medical records, so in EMIS TPP. The aggregation comes back up, it is checked and validated, so you never get access. There's no access from the person coming through there. It's a single front door, but there is zero access to the data. And so that is a nice paradigm, I think, to work within.
Are you convinced?
the NHS are extraordinarily bad at cybersecurity. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't agree. The NHS are extraordinarily bad at cybersecurity, and it's never the tech that is wrong. It's the simple human who makes a fundamental mistake and allows access. And I think in every single area of mass sort of engineering failure, it's usually the person they make an error. So I'm sorry, I'm not.
Yeah, because ONS, as you know, for our colleagues from abroad, Office for National Statistics, they're a data science organisation, and they have framed something called the 5 Safes framework, which is safe people, so you know who's working on safe data, which is anonymised or de-identified as much as you can. In safe places, no data travel. Safe projects in the public interest, and safe outputs, disclosure control. So it's multiple layers of security. But I agree entirely. You know, it takes me back when I was chief scientist in Scotland. Remember the WannaCry virus? Do you remember the WannaCry? So it hit NHS systems. So I was asked to phone a very large health board, about 1 million, but I said, WannaCry virus is in Scotland. Alert your NHS cybersecurity team. And the colleague I was speaking to said, that will be tricky. I said, why is that? He said, he's on holiday. But they're not. So we have to outsource this. You know, Amazon Web Services probably have, 10,000 people doing this stuff? But understanding that relationship and where the risk lies is really important. So.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, it is a moving target, right? You develop this security system, hackers get an even better method to hack that security system. So I think it's a complex problem.
Yes. And with the advent of quantum, it's going to become very tricky.
Yeah,
So.
We'll have to talk about quantum later.
Oh yeah, we can have another session on quantum. No, we'll go to Minia.
Thank you. So I do believe in the superhighway, but unfortunately there are potholes in that highway. And some of those have already been mentioned, so maybe I can just get the panel's perspective on 3 potholes I just want to go through. The first is that a lot of the data that I have in the NHS and so on, and you know, as working as an NHS clinician, is unstructured, but it's a wealth of data. And you know, what are the opportunities of being able to use that unstructured data? The second pothole, which represents an opportunity as well, is that when we talk about linkages to hospitals and HES, that's only partial amount of data. I was talking to Will about this earlier. There's a huge amount of very valuable data in secondary care settings and tertiary care settings that we can never access at the moment. And how do we actually overcome that particular challenge? And the third pothole is that I'm trying to set up a cluster randomized trial, which I'm going to use within a database and so on to be able to do that. But there are many, many challenges that I have to overcome at the moment to be able to set up that cluster randomized trial. And you know, if we want to be able to do the trials much more efficiently, use kind of digi-trials type of approaches, etc., we're going to have to develop better pathways to be able to do that. And so, you know, it would be great to get perspectives on how we do all those, you know, try to fix those 3 potholes, which I think are opportunities for us to be able to actually go further than where we are at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to address the pothole?
I'll try the first one.
Okay.
So for the first pothole, I'm aware of 2 solutions to the unstructured data issue. The first one would be we now have artificial intelligence helping process that unstructured data. So we get insights from medical notes, from biopsy results, etc. But I think the longer-term solution is not to rely on artificial intelligence. We need our electronic health record system to be more systematic in how we input things. So we have less unstructured data to process in the first place. So I think that will be the longer-term way to address that. Yeah.
So do you think ambient documentation, which allows coding directly through ambient documentation, might be a way?
Ambient documentation, limiting things to drop-downs, for example, having AI predict what the clinician is going to input. So for example, you type MYOCAR, so myocardial infarction. So, and that's already captured as a code, for example. So there are smart ways to do it, yeah.
And exactly, there's a great webcast from Stanford actually, because they've got an arrangement with OpenAI, and they are automating, automating discharge letters through the application of OpenAI. and also pulling out structured coding from text using NLP. So, but having case studies which are scalable is going to be our challenge, I think. Okay, now I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then we're going on to the final plenary, which is going to be fantastic. But let's have 2 final questions. Gentleman there.
Thank you for a very interesting and engaging talk. My name's Asatosh Yagnik. I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to ask the first one and then see what the response is before I come on to the second one. So we've heard about a number of different challenges with data. Interoperability, governance, the research funding that goes behind it, access, federated. One thing that we haven't spoken about, although I guess it's there, is the organizational and cultural barriers that exist. I'd like to hear the panel's view on if you were going to address one first to try and help with the process of using this data in a better way, which one of these challenges would it be? And then I'd like to come on to the second question after.
Okay, so you're allowed 1-word answers. What is the one thing you think which will act as an accelerator of this? Let's start. We'll mix it up a bit. Will.
Can I have a sentence?
A sentence.
Very short
okay.
sentence.
Short sentence.
Primary legislation that enforces any new EHR systems to have read access to research, so that's linked contractually within all of them, and we don't have to go through that.
Okay, so we've got a lawyer in the room. Next, Richard.
Change the names and the remits of some of the regulators. Why can't we have a national data sharer instead of a guardian? Why can't we have access advisory group instead of confidentiality advisory group? CAG, they pronounce it GAG.
Okay, there we go. So something on terminology. Adrian?
I'll stick to SDEs. I think they hold much promise. And I think single-gated SDs in particular would be the best model for us to catch up or continue to lead the way if we are there.
Okay, so an infrastructure answer. Michelle?
I think it does come back to the benefit for patients and for people to actually individually benefit. And I think when we start to see that, it will be a game changer.
Okay, and being Socratic, what's your answer?
Well, so my question really, second question really that I wanted to come back on was
True Socratic.
You should be on Newsnight.
We are in Perth though, so I have to learn to deflect. No, the second question was, we've heard a lot about SDEs and interoperability and the benefit for patients, and data which is unstructured. How important do you think it is going to be to focus on trying to get a federated, and not a federated system, a unified system, and unstructured data which then becomes structured, given that with AI, is it going to be easier and cheaper to train the AI to go across federated systems rather than try and link them all together?
Okay, Will, you want to take that one?
I don't think it needs to be AI for federated to be the right. I think federation can work in of itself without AI. Simple queries federated makes sense, just need standardization. The AI is going to do the enrichment, and I don't think we need to worry as much about good data with AI enriched data, and the process should be do all we can with what we've got and train algorithms to improve it.
Yeah, and I think these will be tools which will act as an accelerant to where we need to be. So.
And by the way, I agree, it needs to be pulled from patient side. That's going to be the biggest accelerator, I think.
Put the patient at the heart of everything we do. So, okay, and then the final, we could go on. Apparently there's a dinner tonight. So.
We've spoken a lot about the patient data, but for most of our lives we're citizens. And actually, if you look at where a lot of the feedback and pushback, it doesn't come from patients, it comes from citizens. Mm-hmm. And so in a previous life, we ran citizens' juries to debate the use, reuse, and research use of data in the north of England. And a citizens' jury, for those of you who don't know what it is you take a group of people that represent the geography of that area, and we ask them questions about the use of their data for direct care for themselves, indirect care for their loved ones, or for research, whether it be commercial or otherwise. And then over the course of a few days, we gave experts, and they actually changed their answer. After 3 days of being educated, their answers shifted as citizens for the use of their data for commercial research. So my question is, I know we talk a lot about patient engagement, but who is going to do the citizen engagement and the citizen education? Because one day we will all be patients.
Okay.
It's so important. I mean, I think there was this very profound New England Journal of Medicine study that looked at quitting smoking. And, you know, we're finally at a point where there are more people who quit smoking than are starting smoking. And it is directly correlated with the public health dollars invested. So to your point, you can change people's mind in some of the most addictive substances in the world, and probably in some of the viewpoints that they might feel they're most, you know, feel most staunchly about. But it does require significant investment in education, I think, to actually get there.
Okay, and there's a final question. Make it a good one.
Hi. I just want to take the panel back to patients specifically, and specifically patient experience data. We're doing a lot of work with clients at the moment in terms of trawling and getting access to patient experience data. And what is very, very clear is it's completely unharmonious and very, very scattered. And I'd be interested to hear from the panel in terms of what would you do to integrate more of that patient experience data into the NHS data pool, and what kind of data would you feel would be appropriate to be collecting from patients? I know what I would do, but I'd like to hear from you all.
What a good question. Who wants to? So again, it comes to different data types, and this comes from patient-reported outcomes or wearables and stuff. What do you think? Where should we?
Sure. I mean, we kind of do that whole thing. but I think the patient experience is so important because, you know, as we've seen, you can have a medicine that's highly effective on a certain set of endpoints, but does it really move the needle for what the patients care about? This morning it was mentioned that when they developed novel endpoints for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, the patients cared the most about putting their arms on the table. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of progress on this from a technology perspective and really from a regulatory perspective. So I think it just needs to be, continues to need to be a focus of drug developers. And I think we're seeing that across the board, simply because the regulators are asking what really matters to the patients and are you effectively measuring that? With the Affordable Care Act in the United States, or pardon me, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a huge focus on the whole patient and not just, you know, say progression-free survival. Like, what is it that matters to the patient? So, you know, I personally think this is actually a huge opportunity for the future, and ideally we get, you know, more value from the medicines we're developing from the eyes of the people using them.
Okay, so I think we've come to the end. So maybe just to summarize, I think it's been a great discussion. Thank you, panel. So some themes that I've heard is, so thank you for introducing the notion of a super high rate, but we should recognize every country in the world is pursuing this, so it's going to be around delivery. There's been some themes from Richard, for example, meet the user at their door, so that it's a scalable infrastructure but easy to use. Secondly, we heard a great comment about digital maturity, getting the basics right in the health system. Thirdly, how we learn from other communities, the rare disease community. What were the incentives that got us to align around COVID? Fourthly, security. Being able to demonstrate security is important. We heard quite a lot around different data types, different buckets, whether it's patient-generated data, high-resolution data in health systems, specific tools for trials. How do we develop those? And most importantly, we heard the importance of demonstrating trustworthiness and putting the public, citizens, and patients at the heart of everything. And that's where the benefit has to be focused. So that's my thought. I think it's been a great panel. Can we give them all a round of applause? And I'll hand back to Mania.